But nothing, absolutely nothing, is more serious. Nothing has affected world consciousness and world development and world science more than what Africans did in Egypt. That is why it is deadly serious. I've been to places where I've spoken on Egypt, the classes, and the teacher is so nice because she thinks that when I leave, she's going to be able to break down everything I say. And then the students ask serious questions, questions which she thinks will embarrass me, she or he. And I answer it in a way I know she could not go back afterwards and unanswer it. And sometimes after the politeness, the assumption that you're going to go away and you're going to be embarrassed and all that, after the politeness comes the cold stare, hoping you leave very soon. I actually saw that. We went to speak at the Archaeological Society in New York. I will not name the specific place. And they invited me to dinner and everybody was laughing and talking and so forth, trying to soften me up so that when I get on the stage I wouldn't be too militant. And then in the middle of the dinner, this archaeologist started talking about, you know, it's not necessary, it hasn't been decided yet that man was born in Africa. Probably he was born in Asia. And I put down my knife and fork. You know, and I said, that is nonsense. We have been through that before. We have spent so much time with that. They have found all the sequences of man in Africa. How could we talk about Asia after we have searched and searched for early man in Asia? We have found no such type. And everybody is startled, you know, why are you getting so passionate? This is a nice little dinner. And I looked up and I saw a twinkle in his wife's eye. She must have been beating her to death with all sorts of things over the years, and she's so glad that the black man could sit at this table and give him a rough time after eating his food. These are very serious matters. It affects us tremendously because we have found all the traces, all the main traces in the Egyptian civilization coming out of inner Africa. There is no question about it. Sheikh Anthony Up and Theophile Benga showed in lectures that went on for hours with great detail that the language of the Egyptians was an African language, that the so-called Semitic elements came in much later through the movement of other peoples. Long after the classical period of Egyptian pyramid science, mummification, etc., these are later movements and they affected the lexical or surface aspect of the language. They did not affect the deep structure, grammar, which they could trace and show familial relationships with many African languages. We have found hieroglyphs, Egyptian hieroglyphs in West Africa. Our good friend, the former Archbishop of Lagos, Olumide Lucas, has shown in his work, Egyptian religion in West Africa, traces and traces of these things among the Yoruba. We have found the Dogon, who ran away when they heard the Europeans were attacking and destroying their people. They ran into the mountains. Now we find they have close connections with Egyptian thinking. They may actually have affected it and been affected by it in later stages. We are startled by their science. They have found things about the stars that our machines in space only found 3.5 years ago. They were talking about it 5 centuries ago. We are not descended from any little people. The Dogon mapped the movement of the star Sirius B. We only photographed that star in 1970. They danced the orbit of the star 5 centuries ago. The Bardos celebration begins 5 centuries ago. They showed where that star would be up to the year 1990. Our machines show they're dead correct. The African shows its 50-year elliptical orbit. Our machines show they're dead correct. They show its orbit on its own axis. We don't know about that one yet. They pointed to an object flashing and darkening, contracting and expanding within the region of Sirius B. Do you know when we found that? 3.5 years ago. It's a dwarf nova in the region of Sirius B. They call it the egg of the world. The movement of the French into Egypt, the attack in the early 18th century or the middle of the 18th century brought people in like Volney. And when Volney looked at the pyramids and he looked at the Sphinx, he said, these Negroes who now are the objects of our contempt, these were the masters, the makers of our arts and sciences. And he wasn't talking through his hat. All the Europeans who had written about the Africans in the early times had no doubt that they owed much of their science and thinking to the Africans. You look at the Greeks. The Greeks talked of the Egyptians. Herodotus said they were black-skinned and woolly-haired. Others, as Diop has quoted, more than a dozen sources quoting what these Egyptians were. And the Greeks came at the end of the great classical era, after all the pyramids were built, after the marvelous things like the Sphinx and the great mummies, etc., and the Europeans, the first Europeans who came to Africa, around 500 BC, 300 BC rather, because the Persians came around 500, the Greeks under Alexander came around 300 BC. And those Europeans did not despise the Africans, they worshipped them. Do you know who was their god? The African god Zeus went into Greece. Do you know who was the mother of God? Do you know who was the major female figure in the world, not just in Africa, but in Europe? Isis, who married Osiris. You have Isis shrines in Greece, Isis shrines in Rome, Isis shrines in Britain. Even the lunatic Caligula built a shrine to Isis. And do you know who was worshipped as the mother and child for hundreds of years before Michelangelo appeared in the scene and started drawing his family as Jesus? Isis and Horus, the mother and child. That's the beginning of the Black Madonna and Child in Europe. And it was to run right across Europe. And the Europeans worshipped blackness because the Egyptians had made black the divine color. Do you know who the Greeks made the goddess of wisdom? Minerva, a black woman. Whom did they make the goddess of chastity? Artemis, a black woman. Who was the enchantress in the Odyssey? Circe, a black woman with African features. You could see it on the early Grecian vases. Who was Andromeda, who married Perseus, the Greek hero. You could see on vases, although she has European features, she's painted black because black was thought to be the color of beauty. And look at their other Medea, who helped Jason win the Golden Fleece, is represented as a black woman. And whom did they make a god? The first man to be made into a true god by both Africans and Europeans, a black man named Hotep, father of medicine. The Greeks made no claims that were later made by other Europeans. As Martin Bernal points out, it was not until 1830 that there was a deliberate, sustained intellectual attempt to deny the black contribution to ancient Egypt because it made Europeans feel ashamed. So there was a sustained attempt, which is sustained up to this day, to try and deny the African his contribution to the major civilization in the world. They've even argued that Mesopotamian civilization or Sumerian civilization precedes the Egyptian. It is not true. The earliest thing we have found in Mesopotamia is about 2600 BC, whereas the earliest dynasty in Egypt, conservative estimate is 3100 BC, and we have found in 1962 the American team under Bruce Williams and Keith Seal discovered an African pharaoh an African pharaonic dynasty preceding the Egyptian, before the first Egyptian dynasty. And there at Tarseti, at a place called Kustal on the edge of the Sudan, they found that 12 black pharaohs reigned even before the first Egyptian pharaoh. And that all the major elements that were to be the foundation of pharaonic civilization in Egypt had been planted by the blacks. They found the palace facades that will later appear in Egypt there among the blacks. The palace erects there already among the blacks. The falcon god Horus, the sun, the Christ figure, already there among the blacks, 200 years before the first Egyptian dynasty. And if there was Horus, they had to be Osiris, the god figure, the male aspect of God, as Isis was the female aspect of God. And the Africans did not call God he. How can God be a he? He's a he and a she. He must represent the two aspects.